I remember that night more clearly than I remember breakfast this morning. I'd set out late, later than I should have, thinking I'd take the parkway for a quick drive to clear my head. It had rained all day, a slow soaking drizzle that made the world look like it was melting into gray. By the time I reached that narrow stretch of road, the sun had long since vanished behind thick clouds, and the forest closed in on both sides so tightly it felt like the trees themselves were leaning in to watch. My headlights cut a pale swath through the mist, illuminating slick asphalt that reflected the dim light back at me, making every puddle look like it might be a hole into the next world. I was alone, or at least I told myself I was, and the isolation pressed against my chest like a hand I couldn't shake. I was moving cautiously, letting my tires whisper along the wet road, when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a tree stump or maybe a signpost glimmering in the rain. But then I realized it was a figure, standing perfectly still by the guardrail on the cliffside, looking right at me. I swear it wasn't waving or moving, just watching. My pulse shot into my throat, and I slammed on the brakes without meaning to, the tires squealing in protest. I blinked hard, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light, the mist, or my own exhaustion. When I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone. Nothing remained but the guardrail glistening with rain and the fog curling along the edges of the road. My hands shook on the wheel, and I tried to laugh it off, a hollow, shaky sound that made the empty car feel heavier. Every mile forward became heavier, like the fog itself had weight and purpose, curling around my headlights and trying to slow me down. I turned the radio on to fill the silence, but it was useless. Just static that hissed and spat, swallowing my favorite station hole. The soft hum of the engine became the only sound, but even that wasn't enough to quiet the tension coiling in my chest. The silence seemed alive, like it was waiting for something. Somewhere behind me, I thought I heard wet footsteps on asphalt, deliberate and slow. I whipped the car into reverse, checking the rearview mirror. Nothing. Just the curve of the road, stretching endlessly, the mist hiding whatever had made the noise. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that it was just the rain dripping from the trees, but the instinct in my gut told me otherwise. I slowed, almost stopped, just to scan the shadows along the tree lane. That's when I noticed subtle movements. Shapes that didn't belong, half-formed, slipping behind trees and rocks. My skin crawled, and the rational part of my mind shouted at me to drive faster to escape, but the irrational part whispered that moving might draw attention, that maybe the fog and shadows were part of some waiting. I gripped the wheel tight enough for my knuckles to whiten, trying not to breathe too loud. The road bent sharply, a blind corner that dropped toward a cliffside, and I prayed the fog would thin. But it didn't. It clung to the asphalt like a living thing, and I could almost see fingers of it curling toward my tires. At one point I thought I saw the figure again. Just beyond a bend, near the guardrail, the same stillness, the same impossible silence. I slammed on the brakes again, heart hammering so loud I was sure it echoed in the mist. My foot trembled, poised between brake and gas, when I blinked, and it was gone. Just gone. No footprints, no sign it had ever existed. Just the quiet, wet road, stretching ahead like a promise of more hours of isolation. I swallowed hard and forced the car into motion, even as my stomach knotted into tight coils of dread. As I drove, I noticed every sound was amplified. The tires skimming wet asphalt, the drip of rain from leaves, even the hollow sigh of wind through branches. All of it seemed charged, deliberate. I wanted to tell myself it was fear playing tricks, but the clarity of my senses betrayed me. Something was out there. Something that moved in the fog, that lingered just beyond the edge of light. I kept checking the rearview mirror, each time expecting, or dreading, to see that dark shape following me, silent and patient. But nothing. The parkway curved endlessly, a serpentine stretch of black and silver, and I could feel my exhaustion and terror blending into a single, heavy weight that made every motion of the car an effort. At one particularly sharp curve, I thought I heard a whisper. Not words, exactly, just a sound shaped like a breath, like air escaping someone's lungs too close to mine. I froze, hand clutching the wheel so tightly it burned. The fog thickened, and my headlights caught nothing. I told myself it was the wind, the way the rain bounced off the leaves, but that whisper echoed inside my head, following me through every turn. For the first time, I considered stopping entirely, pulling off to the side of the road and waiting for dawn. But instinct screamed at me to keep moving, that if I stopped, it might step closer. Hours passed, though it couldn't have been that long. The forest remained thick, the mist unyielding, the road never straightening enough to see beyond the next curve. Every time I blinked, I expected the figure to appear, and every time I cursed my imagination for lying to me. But the feeling never left, like something was tracking me, pacing me, staying just beyond the headlights. When the road finally began to open, the trees thinning and the fog easing, relief should have come. But it didn't. The memory of that figure, the silence that pressed like water, the unnatural weight of the mist, all of it clung to me, an invisible passenger I couldn't shake. I reached a stretch where the forest finally opened, where the yellow lines were no longer slick with rain, where the road felt familiar again. And still, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting that dark shape to be there, still standing on the guardrail watching me leave. I stopped at a diner not far off the parkway, hands trembling, telling myself I was safe. The waitress smiled, warm and mundane, and I laughed at the absurdity of my fear. But when I tried to explain what happened, my words felt hollow, inadequate, and I realized that some experiences aren't meant to be shared. They cling to you, stay in the corners of your mind, and whisper in the quiet moments. Even now, years later, I drive that stretch with my eyes wide, not because I expect to see the figure again, but because I remember the weight of that night, the way the fog seemed alive, the way the silence pressed against me with patience I could never escape. I can't explain what I saw, and I don't try. I just know that something was there, waiting, watching, and maybe it's still out there, lingering in the misty bends of the Blue Ridge Parkway, waiting for the next traveler to slow their car, blink, and wonder if what they saw was real, or if it was the road itself reaching for them. The memory of that night hasn't faded. The tension, the creeping dread, the impossible stillness of that figure. It all follows me like a shadow, quiet but insistent. I know I'm never truly alone on that road, and I never will be again. The parkway has a way of keeping its secrets, and some nights, if the mist rolls in thick enough, you can feel it pressing close, reminding you that not everything that watches is visible, and not everything that waits is patient. I remember that night with a clarity that still unsettles me every time I think about it. I'd been driving through the Blue Ridge Parkway late, the kind of night where the road disappears into shadow almost immediately, and every curve feels like it's leading somewhere you don't want to go. It had rained lightly during the day, leaving the asphalt slick and the leaves along the roadside dripping. The winding stretch I was on was narrow, lined with dense trees that bent close enough over the road to blot out the sky. I was used to driving it alone, but that night I felt exposed in a way I never had before, like the forest itself was watching me, waiting to see what I would do next. That's when I noticed the car behind me. At first, I thought it was just someone else taking the same road, a lone traveler like me. But the headlights, they were different. Blinding, almost too bright for a regular vehicle, and unnerving in how still they appeared, despite the curves and hills. I let off the gas for a moment, hoping the car would pass me or that I had misjudged the distance. It didn't. Every time I slowed, it slowed. Every time I turned a sharp corner, it stayed at the exact same impossible distance behind me. My chest tightened. Minutes stretched into hours, and hours felt like minutes. My phone had no signal, my hands were slick on the wheel, and the tension in my shoulders made every movement feel deliberate and exhausting. I tried not to panic. I told myself it was probably just some driver like me, tired, maybe even a bit reckless. But something about the way it followed me, the eerie, unwavering persistence, made my stomach twist. I could feel it more than see it, the presence behind me. I kept checking the rearview mirror, but it didn't behave like a normal car. It never swerved, never adjusted, never made a sound that matched its size. Its headlights remained a constant blinding glare, and I swear, sometimes I thought I caught glimpses of a shape inside. Twisted, unnatural, not quite human. I pulled into a tiny overlook off the road, needing to catch my breath and figure out what I was doing. I expected the car to pass, maybe disappear into the bends of the parkway. But it stopped too, perfectly aligned with the road, engine silent. I sat there, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles ached, staring at that still blinding light. The longer I looked, the more certain I became that the silhouette inside didn't belong to a person. It slumped in ways that felt wrong, unnatural. I blinked and it was gone just like that, as if it had never been there at all. The rest of the drive was a haze. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that the tension, the shadows, the mist swirling through the trees had conjured something my mind needed to see. But even when the road straightened, when the forest thinned and the darkness seemed less oppressive, the feeling didn't leave me. It was still there, lingering in the corners of my vision, a persistent gnawing unease that refused to dissipate. Every time I thought about turning onto a different road, my stomach clenched, my senses heightened. I was waiting for those headlights to appear again, and I knew if they did, I would never forget it. Even after the road opened into the valleys, even after the first lights of the town appeared, my body refused to relax. My hands shook on the wheel, and every passing car made me flinch, half expecting it to be the same impossible vehicle. I drove for miles in silence, listening to the hum of my tires over wet asphalt, the faint whistle of wind through roadside trees, anything to remind myself I was alone. But I wasn't. Not that night. Something had followed me, or at least, my mind told me so, and the memory has never been kind. Years later, I sometimes take that stretch again, though never at night. Even in the daylight, the bends and curves, the dense woods leaning in close, remind me of that night. I think about what it could have been, the unwavering headlights, the strange silhouette, but I know I'll never find an answer. Some things I've learned are meant only to unsettle, to remind you that the world is bigger and darker than you think, and that the forest, the roads, and the mist hold secrets you aren't meant to fully understand. That night on the parkway left a mark I can't erase. Every time I see headlights approaching in the rearview mirror, even on ordinary streets, my pulse quickens. The impossible persistence of that car, the quiet presence that followed me, is something that's lodged itself in my mind, a subtle, unrelenting terror. And though the road stretches wide and clear before me now, I know the feeling is still there, waiting, patient, like the shadows of the Blue Ridge Parkway themselves, reminding me that what follows isn't always visible, and what lingers isn't always meant to be caught. The morning started like any other, gray and wet, with the mist already low over the valleys and clinging to the mountainsides. I had set out early, hoping to catch the sunrise along the Blue Ridge Parkway, but when I reached that familiar stretch, the fog had rolled in so thick it swallowed everything. I could barely make out the curve of the road or the hood of my car. My headlights were little more than dim slashes in the white nothingness. At first, I told myself it was just a heavy fog, normal for the mountains in late autumn, and that I just needed to drive carefully. But there was a weight to it, something that pressed close and made the air feel thicker, almost solid. As I crept forward, I thought I glimpsed movement in the mist. Something that looked like a hand, pressed flat against the gray, reaching, beckoning. My stomach twisted and my fingers clenched the wheel until my knuckles whitened. I told myself I had seen things before in the mountains. Shadows cast by trees, shapes formed by the mist, but this was different. It felt deliberate, patient. The fog didn't swirl randomly. It seemed to curl and shift as I moved, as if it were aware of my car, aware of me. Every sound became amplified. The drip of water from the trees onto the asphalt, the snap of a branch somewhere just out of sight, even the wind brushing against my mirrors. Each noise made me flinch, my heart hammering as though it could burst through my chest. I slowed almost to a crawl, willing my eyes to pierce the gray, willing the fog to clear, but it refused. It moved with me, a living, breathing wall that kept me trapped inside its weight. I tried to call someone, anything, but my phone had no signal. The mountains swallowed my voice, my connection to the outside world, leaving me alone with that oppressive silence. I kept telling myself it was just the fog, just my imagination playing tricks, but the longer I drove, the less certain I became. The mist seemed to thicken whenever I blinked, pressing against the car like it had purpose, curling around the tires and headlights as though it wanted to keep me from leaving. At one point, I thought I heard a faint scrape along the side of the road like someone, or something, was walking just out of sight. I slowed, straining to see past the white, and that's when I felt it, the sense of being watched. Not in a casual way, but like eyes had found me, waiting for me to make a mistake. My chest tightened, and I could feel sweat running down my back even though the air was cold and damp. I kept moving forward, not daring to stop, but every mile felt heavier, the road endless, the fog unyielding. Then I saw it again. A hand, pressed against the fog, more distinct this time. Fingers splayed, knuckles pale against the gray, reaching for something that wasn't there. I slammed my foot to the brake, jerking the wheel to keep the car straight. My pulse roared in my ears. I forced myself to breathe slowly, counting to 10, willing the terror to pass, but it didn't. The hand was gone in the blink of an eye, leaving nothing but the thick, silent white. My rational mind told me it had to be a trick of the light, the way fog distorts shapes and shadows, but the raw fear in my chest refused to listen to reason. 4 hours, I drove through that void. Every bend in the road, every rise and dip, seemed designed to make me lose orientation. I couldn't tell if I was moving forward or just going in circles. The fog clung to my car, coiling around it like some living thing, and I could feel the weight of it pressing against the roof, the hood, even through the tires into the asphalt. I tried to keep my eyes fixed ahead, but every time I glanced at the mirrors, I thought I saw shapes shifting just beyond the mist, following me with patience that made my stomach knot. I pulled into a small clearing off the road, hoping to find some sense of relief, maybe a patch of clearer air, but the fog swallowed that too. The trees around me disappeared into gray, the ground damp and uneven beneath the tires. I stepped out for a breath, and the mist wrapped around me, cold and wet, filling my lungs with the smell of earth and decay. It was silent but not peaceful, like the silence you feel before a storm, heavy and anticipatory. I thought I could hear something breathing, or maybe it was just my own heart, thundering in a chest that felt too small for it. I hurried back into the car, doors locking behind me, and continued down the parkway, moving as slowly as possible without stopping entirely. By late morning, the fog began to thin, but the unease didn't lift. The forest seemed empty now, stripped of the shapes I thought I'd seen, but I could still feel that weight, that patience, lingering in the corners of my vision. Even when the sun broke through briefly, glinting off wet leaves and distant hills, I felt it behind me, patient and silent. The sense of being watched never fully left. Not on that day and not in the days that followed. I couldn't explain what I'd seen, or if I had truly seen anything at all, but I knew that stretch of the parkway had a memory of its own, and it had chosen me to witness it. Even now, years later, I drive that road with caution. Never at dawn, never when the mist might roll in again. I can't shake the memory of the shapes, the reaching hand, or the oppressive weight of the fog. I think about the people who have traveled that stretch alone before me, and those who will come after, and I can't help but wonder if they feel it too, the creeping presence that waits patient in the mist. And though the parkway eventually opens into valleys and clearings, the memory stays lodged in my chest, a silent reminder that the mountains hold their secrets tightly, and some things are never meant to be fully understood. I stopped at one of the overlooks along the Blue Ridge Parkway to stretch my legs, the kind of spot where the forest opens for just a moment, revealing the valleys below, and the wind carries a faint chill from the mountains. It was quiet. Too quiet for a morning that should have been filled with birds and the occasional rustle of small animals in the brush. I stepped out, taking a deep breath of the damp air, hoping to shake the stiffness from my back after hours of driving. At first, the wind was gentle, brushing against my face and tugging lightly at my jacket, carrying with it a soft sound that I almost dismissed as nothing more than the trees whispering among themselves. I laughed nervously, the sound hollow and awkward in the empty overlook, trying to convince myself it was just that, the trees, the leaves, the wind. But the sound didn't fade. It sharpened, subtle at first, almost like a breath carried too far by the wind, then more deliberate, closer, like words forming in some language I almost, but couldn't, understand. My stomach knotted, a cold weight settling low in my gut. I called out, a nervous, half-laughing, half-questioning, "Hello!" And the sound vanished into the air, swallowed by the emptiness. That's when I first felt it, eyes. Not human eyes, at least not in a way I could recognize, but the sensation of being watched, scanned, assessed. My skin prickled as though the wind itself carried attention, pressing against me with a weight that made every hair on my arms stand at attention. I tried to move, to convince myself to step back toward the car, but my legs refused to cooperate. They were rooted in the damp grass, frozen by a dread I didn't yet understand. The whispers grew sharper, clearer, urgent, as though some invisible voice was calling my name, dragging it through the wind and the air in a way that felt impossibly close. I couldn't make out words, but the cadence, the insistence, struck me with an icy clarity. Someone or something was trying to get my attention. My heartbeat pounded, loud enough to echo in my ears, as the air pressed thicker and colder around me. The overlook, which had seemed peaceful and inviting moments before, felt hostile now, like stepping into a threshold I shouldn't have crossed. I stumbled backward toward the car, hands shaking, my breath coming in ragged bursts. Every step felt heavier than it should, like the grass itself resisted me. I fumbled with the door handle, finally wrenching the door open and collapsing into the seat, doors locking behind me. The whispers didn't stop. Even from inside the car, muffled by metal and glass, I could hear them, distant but unmistakable, fading and returning like the echo of some song carried across the mountains. I gripped the wheel, trying to start the engine, praying the sound would vanish as I drove away. But it didn't vanish completely. It lingered, fading behind me but always present in the periphery of my hearing, impossible to pin down, impossible to explain. The drive away from the overlook was tense and slow. Every curve, every rise in the road seemed to stretch the sound, carrying it along the tree line, trailing me like a shadow. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that fear had twisted the natural noises of the forest into something sinister, but my instincts screamed otherwise. There was something in the air that morning, something deliberate and patient, and I knew instinctively it hadn't wanted me to leave. The forest pressed in closer than usual, the branches leaning over the parkway like hands reaching toward the car, and the mist, thin and lingering, curled along the asphalt with a slow, deliberate rhythm, almost as if it were guiding me along a path it had chosen. I kept glancing at the mirrors, half expecting to see a figure at the edges of the fog or a movement that wasn't my own reflection, but the road behind me remained empty. Still, the feeling of being observed never left. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me flinch, and I found myself gripping the wheel until my knuckles ached, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The whispers returned at irregular intervals, soft and almost teasing, fading into the mountains only to return with a deliberate rhythm, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. My breathing became shallow and deliberate, trying to match the cadence of the whispers without understanding why, and it was exhausting in a way I can't put into words. Hours, or maybe minutes, time blurred in that tense, heavy drive. Passed before I finally reached a wider stretch of road where the mist thinned and the trees leaned back, letting sunlight filter through. Relief should have come, a sense of safety, but it didn't. The whispers were gone, yes, but the memory of them, the pressure of unseen eyes, the thick weight of the air itself, lingered in my chest. Every time I glanced at the overlook where I had stopped, I felt that pull again, a subtle tug in the pit of my stomach that warned me the forest had not finished with me. The Blue Ridge Parkway, serene and breathtaking in daylight, had shown me a face that morning I couldn't unsee, a whispering, watching presence that was patient, invisible, and deliberate. Even now, years later, when I pass that overlook during bright daylight, I feel a twinge of that same fear. I don't stop, not anymore, because the memory of being rooted to the spot, of hearing those whispers pressing against me, reminds me that the mountains keep secrets. They do not release them easily, and sometimes they take their time. The encounter left a mark in my mind, subtle but persistent, a reminder that isolation in the forest is never truly alone, that the air itself can carry attention, and that some presences in the Appalachian woods are patient enough to wait decades, if necessary, for someone to hear them, to feel them, and to never forget. I had driven that stretch of the Blue Ridge Parkway more times than I could count, the curves and bends so familiar that I could navigate most of it without thinking. That night, though, it felt different, as if the forest itself had shifted while I wasn't looking. The road was slick from a thin, persistent rain, and a low mist clung to the edges of the trees, curling over the guardrails in wisps that made the cliffs below nearly disappear. I was alone, headlights cutting weakly through the darkness, when I saw him. He was hunched over on the guardrail, facing the drop, completely still, staring down at the cliffs below. I slowed instinctively, instinct more than thought, heart already thudding. At first, I thought maybe he had fallen or was injured, but there was something wrong about him. The way he moved, or rather didn't move, the stiffness in his posture, the way his head tilted slightly as though listening for something I couldn't hear. I rolled down my window and called out, my voice cracking in the cold night air. "Hey, are you okay?" Nothing. No reply. No shift in stance. He didn't even blink. I blinked myself, and when my eyes opened again, he was gone. Just like that, vanished. I swallowed hard, gripping the wheel tighter than I realized, scanning the road ahead and behind, trying to convince myself that the darkness had played a trick on me. The mist had obscured my view for a fraction of a second, maybe, or the curve in the road had hidden him. But then I noticed something else. His footprints. I had expected to see wet impressions in the dirt or mud along the shoulder, the trace of his presence. There was nothing, just smooth, untouched ground, as if he had never been there at all. I felt my stomach twist, a cold weight settling deep, and my hands tightened on the wheel. The highway stretched before me, the familiar bends suddenly alien and menacing. Every shadow along the tree lane seemed heavier than it should be, every gust of wind pressing against the car like it carried a message. I told myself it had to be my imagination, exhaustion, and the monotony of the drive conjuring shapes from shadow, but my gut didn't believe it. There was a presence in that moment, patient and deliberate, that left an imprint even when I couldn't see it. I drove on slowly, glancing at every curve, expecting him to appear again. The forest felt close, pressing in from both sides, and the guardrails that had always seemed protective now felt like boundaries I was being warned not to cross. The sound of rain dripping from the leaves was deafening in my own mind, echoing unnaturally in the darkness. Every tree seemed to twist at the edges of my vision, branches bending just enough to suggest motion, just enough to make me think I was being followed. My headlights caught nothing but road and mist, yet the sensation of being watched persisted, crawling along the back of my neck and down my spine. Hours later, though I couldn't have measured the time precisely, I finally reached a stretch where the road leveled and the mist thinned. Relief should have come, but it didn't. The image of him, hunched and still, his empty eyes fixed on the abyss, lingered in my mind like a stain I couldn't scrub clean. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a shadow at the edge of the trees, but the road behind me remained empty, deceptively calm. Even then, I couldn't shake the sense that something had followed me, not in the traditional sense, but in a way that left its mark, invisible yet unmistakable. I stopped at a small diner not long after, hoping the warmth and light would help me shake the memory. I ordered coffee, trembling slightly, and forced myself to talk to the waitress about the drive, anything to anchor myself in reality. But the words felt hollow. How could I explain that I'd seen a man appear and vanish without a trace, that the ground where he had stood showed no sign of him ever being there? I sipped the bitter coffee, the steam rising in front of my face like a thin fog, and realized that some experiences are meant to be unshared, meant only to linger in memory and gnaw quietly at the edges of sanity. Even now, years later, I drive that section of the parkway with a heightened awareness, eyes darting to the guardrails, scanning every shadow and bend. I've never seen him again, and yet I carry the memory like a weight. Sometimes, when the wind presses just right against the car or the mist curls in from the trees, I feel the same cold watching sensation, the same prickling unease along my skin, and I remember that night. The stranger on the guardrail wasn't just a figure in the dark. He was a reminder of how small and fragile we are in the face of the mountains, of the forest, and of the unknown. I can't explain it, and I don't try. The parkway has its secrets, and some of them are patient enough to wait decades before showing themselves. I know that stretch of road better than most, but the memory of those empty eyes haunts me every time I think of it. And perhaps that's the thing about the forest and the cliffs, the dark and the rain. It keeps a record of who passes through, marking those who notice too much, and leaving a whisper in your chest long after the road has straightened and the forest has thinned. I've learned not to stop there anymore, not at night, not at dusk, not when the mist rolls in and the air presses cold against my skin. I keep moving, eyes forward, hands tight on the wheel, heart thudding like a drum I can't silence. And still, the memory follows me, quiet but persistent, a shadow of a man who may have been human, or may have been something else entirely, leaning over the guardrail and staring into the dark, reminding me that some things in the mountains are patient, deliberate, and invisible, but never truly gone. I remember that night as if it were carved into my memory with fire. My car had started acting up, sputtering and jerking along the familiar curves of the Blue Ridge Parkway, and I had no choice but to pull over at the nearest rest stop. It was one of those tiny, unassuming spots, the kind you might not notice unless you were already looking for it, sandwiched between dense forest and a steep drop into a valley. I expected at least one other vehicle, maybe a tired traveler like me, but when I arrived, it was completely deserted. No headlights, no muffled radio music, not even a stray piece of trash drifting in the wind. The place was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes you wonder if you've stepped into a vacuum. I parked and stepped out, stretching my legs and rubbing the tension from my shoulders. The air was damp, the smell of wet leaves and moss heavy in my nostrils. The rest stop building was small, nondescript, but when I walked inside, the sense of unease deepened. It was cold, far colder than it should have been, and the lights flickered intermittently, casting uneven shadows across the empty counters and concrete floor. Shelves that should have held snacks or maps were bare. The restroom doors hung slightly open, revealing darkness that seemed too thick for such a small space. I called out, half joking to myself, and the sound bounced back in the empty room, distorted by the quiet. No answer. No other presence. I went back outside, needing to see my car to ground myself in the familiar, but it was off. It wasn't where I had parked it. It had been mere yards away when I stepped out, and now it seemed farther, almost as if it had shifted when I wasn't looking. My stomach tightened as I hurried toward it, my breath misting in the cold night air. I half expected to see tire tracks marking my path, evidence that I hadn't imagined my steps, but there was nothing. The gravel remained untouched, pristine, as if my car had simply appeared there, and I had never walked across that space at all. My pulse hammered against my ribs, and a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the air. I climbed in and started the engine, glancing once more at the building behind me. It was small, familiar, and yet wrong. The angles seemed slightly off, the roof lower, the windows narrower. The flickering light cast shadows that didn't belong to anything in the real world, bending across the walls in impossible ways. The trees around the rest stop pressed closer than they should have, the forest swallowing the edges of the clearing in a way that made the place feel temporary, fragile, like it was a set piece waiting for someone to leave so it could vanish. As I drove off, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The rest stop receded, but the unease didn't. The air seemed heavier, denser, as if the place had exhaled something into my car when I had entered. My hands shook on the wheel, and my eyes darted to every curve, every shadow, expecting something impossible to appear, something left behind by the momentary existence of that strange, deserted place. There were no signs of anyone else ever having been there, and yet the memory of that cold, flickering interior, the way the shadows seemed almost alive, stayed with me. Hours later, long after the road straightened and the familiar bends of the parkway returned, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had driven through a pocket of the world that had peeled back just enough to reveal something else, something patient and deliberate, hiding behind the veil of the ordinary. The rest stop had felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain, and the knowledge of that wrongness lingered, gnawing at the edges of my awareness. Even now, I can picture the place in my mind. The flickering lights, the empty counters, the cold, silent air that pressed against my skin. I've never gone back, not even during the day, and I've never told anyone the full story because it doesn't feel like a story meant for sharing. It feels like a warning. The parkway is filled with bends, overlooks, and rest stops, but not all of them are as they seem. Some exist only for a moment, waiting for someone to notice, to step inside, to feel the pressure of their attention, before fading into memory and shadow. Sometimes, when I drive late at night, alone, I imagine seeing that flickering light in the distance again, the faint outline of the building barely visible through the mist. My hands tighten on the wheel, and I remember the way the air had pressed against me, the unnatural cold of the empty room, the feeling that something in that place was alive in its own way, watching, waiting, patient. I know that even if I never see the rest stop again, it exists somewhere just beyond the edge of perception, reminding me that some moments, some places are not meant to be fully understood, only survived. The memory of that night has stayed with me, an invisible weight, a quiet terror lodged in the back of my mind. I drive carefully now, checking shadows and reflections more than I ever did before, and I know deep down that the parkway holds more than bends and overlooks. It holds patience, and it remembers the people who pass through, even when the world itself seems to forget. That tiny vanishing rest stop is proof of it, a place that shouldn't exist, and yet did, long enough to leave its mark. I remember that evening like it was etched into my memory in slow motion. The sun was just dipping below the ridges of the Blue Ridge Mountains, painting the valleys and peaks in shades of deep orange, purple, and bruised indigo. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of wet leaves and pine, the kind of smell that makes the forest feel alive even as it grows quiet. I was driving alone, following the parkway home after a long day of work, when I noticed the taillights. Dim, almost faint in the gathering dusk, red dots ahead of me that moved along the road with an unsettling deliberateness. At first, I thought it was just another car, someone heading the same way I was. I kept a reasonable distance, following carefully, but every time I adjusted my speed, the lights did too. They stopped abruptly at a bend in the road, vanished down a tiny side path between the trees, and just as I slowed to avoid overshooting, they reappeared further ahead, always just out of reach. It was disorienting, the way they seemed to have a rhythm of their own, stopping and starting like they were aware of my presence, leading me along without ever letting me close the distance. My hands tightened on the wheel, knuckles white, and my pulse hammered in a way that felt synchronized with the light's elusive movements. I started to feel an unease I couldn't explain, the kind that sits low in your stomach and spreads slowly up your chest. Every turn, every curve, seemed to stretch the road longer than it should be, as if the parkway itself had changed while I wasn't looking. Trees leaned closer, shadows pooling unnaturally where the fading sunlight should have been spilling golden over the slopes. The forest grew silent around me. Not a bird sang, not a leaf rustled. Even the hum of my tires over the asphalt seemed muted, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. Each time the lights disappeared, I felt a compulsion to follow, to see where they went, though a part of me screamed against it. They turned down little paths that looked like old logging roads, narrow tracks swallowed by undergrowth and darkness, places I wouldn't have dared drive if I'd come upon them alone. And yet, each time I hesitated, the tail lights reappeared ahead of me on the main road, almost taunting me, refusing to let me close the gap. The sun had long set by then, leaving the mountains bathed in a bruised twilight, and I was surrounded by darkness that felt heavy, almost physical. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed, though it could have been less. The tail lights never left, always ahead, always just out of reach. I stopped trying to make sense of it, stopped trying to rationalize it. The car's presence, the way it vanished and reappeared, the impossible patience with which it led me along, had a purpose, though I had no idea what it was. I could feel it in the air, in the subtle press of the wind against my face, in the shifting shadows along the roadside. It was as if the forest itself was guiding me somewhere, using that car as an instrument, patient and deliberate. At one point, I tried to turn off the parkway, to lose it, to take a side road back toward town. But each road I chose led me back to the same stretch, the same dim, elusive taillights waiting for me around the next bend. My pulse pounded in my ears, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. I could feel every muscle in my body tightening, ready for something I didn't understand. And yet, despite the fear, there was a magnetic pull, a compulsion to keep following, as though whatever was ahead had a claim on me, and I couldn't deny it. The night grew colder, the mist rising from the valleys and clinging to the forest floor. Headlights and tail lights glimmered faintly through the haze, but the elusive car never slowed, never paused in a way that allowed me to close in. Its movements were deliberate, precise, and impossible to read. Each time I thought it would vanish for good, it reappeared further along, the red dots glowing faintly in the darkness like eyes. I could feel the dread pooling in my stomach, a cold, patient awareness that I was being led somewhere, though I had no idea where or why. Eventually, the parkway straightened and the forest thinned, but the taillights were still there, still out of reach, still calling me forward in silence. I can't explain what I saw that night. No one else has, at least not in any way I can describe. I drove on, exhausted, tense, and bewildered, eventually returning to a stretch of road I recognized, but the feeling never left me. Every time I think of that night, I feel the same cold pull, the same patient awareness that someone or something was just ahead, waiting, watching, guiding me along a path I wasn't meant to understand. Even now, when I drive the parkway at dusk, I glance at every curve, every shadow, half expecting those faint tail lights to appear just ahead, ready to lead me somewhere I shouldn't go. The memory of that night lingers, a quiet, insistent unease lodged deep in my chest, a reminder that the mountains hold secrets, and some paths, some presences, are patient enough to wait for decades to be noticed. Some things I've learned are never truly gone. They just vanish at dusk, waiting for the next traveler to follow blindly into the dark. I'd driven the parkway countless times, every bend and rise etched into memory. Yet there was one curve I'd always avoided. It had been closed for years, barricaded with weathered signs and overgrown with weeds. Saplings pushing through cracks in the asphalt. Locals whispered about it, saying it was dangerous, that the earth beneath had shifted, that strange things happened there after dark. I'd always shrugged it off, chalking it up to rumor, until one night, curiosity gnawed too hard. I found a gap in the barricade, and before I could stop myself, I'd driven onto the old road. The air changed immediately. It was thick, heavier than normal, hanging low and damp, pressing against my skin and slowing my breathing. The trees leaned closer to the asphalt, their branches tangled, clawing toward the car as though trying to keep me inside the curve. My headlights barely cut through the darkness, the beams scattering over twisted vines and weeds that grew up through the cracks like fingers reaching for the sky. Every shadow looked wrong, shifting subtly at the edge of my vision. I told myself it was just exhaustion, just my imagination playing tricks, but my chest tightened with a nervous weight I couldn't shake. As I rounded the first bend, something moved in the brush. I slammed on the brakes, heart pounding, but when I peered into the undergrowth, nothing stirred. Then I saw them. Figures, barely distinguishable from the shadows, standing motionless among the trees. They were tall, thin, unmoving, almost camouflaged by the dark. Their faces were hidden, but I felt them watching, eyes locked on me in silence. The headlights caught them only for a fraction of a second, just enough to recognize their outlines. Then they blended back into the black. My hands tightened on the wheel, and a shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I pressed the accelerator, trying to escape, but the road seemed to stretch unnaturally, each curve longer than it should have been, each shadow deeper. The trees leaned closer, the weeds brushing against the sides of the car, making the old asphalt feel claustrophobic. I thought I heard movement in the darkness behind me, low rustling like branches being bent deliberately, but when I dared a glance in the rearview mirror, there was nothing, just the black maw of the forest swallowing the curve behind me. At one point I nearly lost control. A figure stepped onto the road, frozen yet undeniable, just beyond my headlights. My stomach lurched, and I swerved instinctively, tires skidding over the cracked asphalt, gravel spraying in all directions. When I looked back, it was gone. No footprints, no trace, nothing to suggest it had ever been there except for the imprint it left in my chest. A raw, almost physical fear that clung to me like a second skin. I floored the accelerator, the engine roaring as I barreled through the remainder of the curve, every sense on edge, every shadow a threat, every sound amplified into something monstrous. The overgrown road finally spat me back onto the main parkway, and I didn't slow until I reached a stretch of familiar asphalt. The forest had returned to its normal distance, the trees leaning back, the air lightening. I wanted to laugh at myself, to tell myself it had been a trick of the headlights, the exhaustion, my imagination, but deep down I knew it hadn't been. The feeling of those figures lingered, a pressing awareness in the corners of my vision, like the shadows themselves had left a residue I couldn't shake. I've never returned to that curve. Even years later, the memory returns with an almost physical weight. In quiet moments, when I drive the parkway at night, I feel the pull of that darkness, the bend where the road disappears under weeds and trees, and I swear I can sense those figures waiting, patient and silent. They aren't monsters in the traditional sense, there's nothing exaggerated or grotesque, but their presence is deliberate, calculated, a quiet horror rooted in the forest's patient watchfulness. The encounter taught me something I can't fully articulate, that some places in the mountains aren't abandoned by accident, that the forest has its own memory, its own will, and that those who wander too far off the beaten path may find themselves watched, measured, and left with a lingering unease that never fully leaves. That overgrown curve is still there, waiting, a silent sentinel of the unknown, and though I'll never step onto it again, I carry it with me. The weight of shadows, the brush of unseen eyes, and the memory of a night when the parkway became something darker than I had ever imagined. I remember that night as if it were stretched out in slow motion, every curve of the Blue Ridge Parkway etched into my mind. I was driving late, the kind of late where the forest swallows sound and the world feels compressed into the narrow ribbon of asphalt beneath your tires. The air was damp, carrying the faint smell of wet leaves and earth, and the mountains ahead were shadows against a sky that had long since surrendered its light. I'd been alone for hours, my only companions the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush and the low hum of my own engine. Then it appeared. A truck, large and looming, headlights blazing, tailing me down the winding road. At first, I thought it was a normal vehicle, a late-night hauler making its way through the curves. But the moment it came into view, something felt off. Its lights were blinding, white-hot in my mirrors, and yet, despite its size, it made no sound. No engine growl, no rumble of tires on wet asphalt. I slowed, tried to pull aside onto the shoulder, and it mirrored me exactly, keeping the same distance, matching every bend and hill I navigated as though it were attached to me by some invisible thread. My pulse quickened, and a cold knot of unease settled in my stomach. At first, I rationalized it. Maybe it was my imagination, fatigue twisting shadows into shapes. But the absence of sound was undeniable. I could hear nothing from it. No engine, no tire screech, not even the faintest hum of brakes. Only its lights, relentless and bright, reflecting off wet leaves and slick pavement, always behind me, always matching me perfectly. I gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles white, and tried to convince myself to keep driving, to stay calm. But the unnatural precision of that vehicle, the impossibility of its silence, began to wear on my mind. Minutes, or maybe hours, stretched on like hours compressed into minutes. Every turn I took, every hill I crested, it was there, exactly where it should be, yet impossibly still silent. The forest seemed to lean closer, shadows pooling unnaturally at the edge of the road, as though pressed by some unseen weight. Leaves rustled without wind, branches tapped against themselves, and I kept glancing at the mirrors, half expecting to see the driver's face, but the cab remained opaque, a dark silhouette behind blinding light. My chest tightened, each breath shallow, every instinct screaming that something was deeply wrong. Finally, in a desperate bid for relief, I turned off the parkway onto a small side road leading toward a tiny town. The truck didn't follow. My heart pounded in my ears as I slowed, careful not to look back too quickly. When I finally dared, the highway was empty. No taillights, no vehicle, nothing. The asphalt lay there, wet and gleaming under the dim glow of the few streetlights, completely undisturbed. I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I was holding, hands still trembling on the wheel. And yet, the impossibility of what had just happened clung to me, heavier than any object could. The silence of that truck, the way it followed, matched my every movement, yet emitted no sound, haunted me far more than the roar of any engine ever could. I drove slowly through the town, trying to shake the memory, trying to convince myself that the darkness, fatigue, and isolation had conspired to make me see what wasn't there. But deep down, I knew I hadn't imagined it. The sensation of being followed, of being measured, of being observed with impossible precision, had been real. Even now, years later, when I drive late at night along familiar roads, I feel it. The pressure in the air, the way shadows can move without sound, the way something unseen can track you perfectly. I avoid the parkway after dark, and if I must drive it, my eyes never leave the mirrors, my pulse always aware of the possibility of being followed. The memory of that silent truck is lodged in my mind, a quiet terror that doesn't scream or roar but presses against your chest with patient inevitability. It reminds me that some things in the mountains are deliberate, and that silence can be louder than any noise and just as unforgettable. I remember that evening with a clarity that still unsettles me. The mist had rolled in early, curling along the valleys and threading between the trunks of the Blue Ridge forests like a living thing. I had been driving for hours, fatigue settling into my shoulders and the low hum of the engine lulling my mind into a near dreamlike state. The road was empty, the kind of empty where every rustle of leaves, every creak of branches, feels magnified, as if the forest itself is listening to you. That's when I saw it, a cabin tucked among the trees, warm light glowing from its windows, soft and inviting against the gray haze. I didn't hesitate. My body craved the reprieve, the promise of solid ground and firelight, even if only for a moment. I parked along the shoulder, the mist clinging to the car, damp and cold, and started walking toward the cabin. The forest around me seemed unnaturally still, the usual chorus of nighttime insects muted, the wind absent. Each step I took on the damp earth felt heavier than the last, like I was moving through something thicker than fog, something pressing against my chest in quiet insistence. When I reached the spot where the cabin had been, it was gone. Absolutely gone. No light, no structure, not even the faint outline of a roof against the trees. Just the forest, thick and untouched, with roots and saplings pressing up through the earth as if no human had ever set foot there. I blinked, my heart pounding, convinced I'd made a misstep in the mist, that my eyes had played a trick on me. But even as I turned back toward the car, the road had shifted. The curve I had parked on seemed tighter, the trees closer, the shadows deeper, pressing in from all sides. My breath hitched, and I realized I couldn't remember exactly how I had approached the cabin, only that it had seemed possible, real. Panic crept in, slow and insidious. I ran back to the car, gripping the door handle like it might disappear before my fingers could close around it. When I started the engine and drove, the parkway seemed different. Every familiar turn was twisted just slightly, as if the forest had reshaped itself while I was distracted. The mist thickened around me, swallowing the headlights in a gray void, making the edges of the road impossible to read. I drove for what felt like hours, every bend and curve unfamiliar, until finally, the mist thinned, the road straightened, and I recognized a stretch of the parkway I knew well. Even then, the cabin lingered in my mind, not just as a memory but as a presence. The warm light, the shape of the windows, the impossible promise of safety in the middle of a mist-choked forest, it haunted me. I have driven those mountains countless times since, yet every time the fog creeps in, every time the evening grows gray and thick, I find myself glancing through the trees, half expecting to see the faint glow of that cabin. And each time I see nothing. Just shadows and mist, and the memory of something that shouldn't have existed and yet had. The strangest part is the feeling it left behind. Not fear in the immediate sense, though that was present, but a lingering, almost physical unease. Like the cabin had been a trap, a mirage with intention. Something in that forest knew I would see it, would be drawn toward it, and then it vanished, leaving me changed. The parkway, for all its bends and curves and beauty, now holds a corner of memory I can't erase, a space where reality flexed, where the ordinary world bent just enough to let the impossible exist, if only for a heartbeat. I don't know if the cabin was ever real, or if it was a trick of the mist and exhaustion, but the memory is vivid enough to make my skin prickle even now. That night taught me to respect the forest in a way I hadn't before, to understand that the mountains have patience, and that some places are meant to be glimpsed but never reached. The parkway is full of bends, of quiet glades, of fog-shrouded hollows, but that cabin exists only in memory, a ghostly sentinel reminding me that the mountains sometimes rearrange themselves, and that we are not always in control of the paths we travel. Even now, when the mist rolls in and the evening settles like a blanket over the ridges, I see it in my mind's eye. I see the warm glow through the trees, the way the windows seem to pulse softly against the mist, the way the forest pressed close as I approached. And though I drive on, safe on the familiar stretches of asphalt, I feel the weight of that impossibility pressing just behind my eyes, a quiet reminder that some things in the mountains exist only to be glimpsed and remembered, leaving their mark on those who witness them forever.